Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Mayfield, Director of the California Center for Algae Biotechnology and a Professor of Biology at the University of California, San Diego. Today we're going to talk about algae biotechnology and specifically about the potential as well as some of the challenges that are facing us today. There is no single challenge that I would cite as being the most important. Instead, there are three interacting events or resources, energy, food, and water, that all have enormous challenges for this planet. Together, these combined to also drive climate change. And I think those, more than anything else, are ones that we really have to address as a society. Perhaps one easy way to think about this is shown in this graph. This is a graph of world population and energy production over the last 10,000 years. Clearly, we can see a tight correlation between our use of fossil fuel, shown in the blue, and world population, shown in the red. There are a variety of reasons that these things interact, but one of the main ones is that we as a society have used fossil fuels over just the last few hundred years to first drive the Industrial Revolution and more recently the Agricultural Revolution, which has allowed for production of vast quantities of food. This has been an enormous benefit to the planet and kept as many as 1 billion people out of starvation, but it has also allowed the world populations to increase to the 7.6 billion people on the planet today. And with that many people on the planet, our competition for resources is really great. One of these can be shown in this, which is there's population density, and our requirement for protein specifically is directly related to the worldwide decline in fish populations. We are simply fishing all the fish out of the ocean. This happens to be a graph of fish caught in the North Atlantic, and it shows that those fish catches peaked in 1975 and have decreased every year since then. The graph on the right shows an extrapolation of this to all of the world's oceans and shows that if we continue at our present rate of exploiting this resource without allowing it to recover, we will have fished all of the fish out of the ocean by 2040. This demand for protein also results in an increased deforestation for agricultural production, primarily for the production of soybeans, which are used to feed livestock animals like chickens, pigs, and cows. This is a map of deforestation over the last several decades, and even today this continues to accelerate. If the students will simply Google Cargill deforestation in New York Times, you will find an article from 2017 that describes this deforestation in alarming detail. Our planet is also now covered in plastic trash. Plastic was only invented a little more than 60 years ago, and yet today there are already 17 trillion pounds of plastic on this planet. That is 2,600 pounds of plastic for every man, woman, and child alive today. Plastic is there because it's convenient, it's cheap, and it never degrades by design. There are up to 18 billion pounds of plastic flowing into our oceans every year. And the pictures of the plastic products, including flip-flops and water bottles washing up on beaches throughout the world, can now be seen every day. This simply has to change. We cannot continue to live this way. So although these challenges are great, there are also opportunities here. And one of the opportunities that we think about and that we will describe in this course is to use algae as a new photosynthetic biomanufacturing platform. So what does that mean? That means we are going to use algae as a conversion platform, as the engine that is going to take sunlight and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, nutrients like nitrogen, potassium, phosphate, and water, and then use those to convert into the products that we use today, whether those are plastics or food or fuels or animal or human feed or even pharmaceuticals. So this opportunity is enormous. And why do we think about algae for this? We can define that in many different ways, but a simple one to look at is that algae have biomass and product yields that are much greater than traditional crops and are much more efficient. One way to look at this is the graph shown on the upper left, which is simply biomass accumulation per acre per year. So this is the way productivity is measured in all agriculture. One of the most productive plants on the planet is sugarcane, and sugarcane can accumulate up to 25 tons of biomass per acre per year, but about 80% of that biomass is cellulose, which is not a very valuable product. Algae can accumulate at least twice that biomass, up to 50 tons per acre per year, and really beneficial. That biomass can be accumulated as proteins or oils, two things that we can use directly as animal feed, as human food, or to make many, many different bioproducts, including plastics or fuels. A summary of that is shown on the right, in which we've looked at just two different aspects. Oil yield in terms of gallons per acre. The most productive plant out there is palm oil, which can produce a little over 600 gallons per acre. Algae can now produce 2,000 to 2,500 gallons per acre. If we look at protein, that is even more striking. The world's protein crop is soybean. That produces about 350 pounds per acre per year. With algae, we can hit up to 10,000 pounds per acre per year. So it are those efficiencies and yield that really suggest the potential of algae for the future. The other thing is that algae can now be grown at world scale, and we can utilize non-arable land and non-potable water. I have two examples of how we're going to produce algae. One are the open ponds shown on the left. The other is a fermentation tank shown on the right. And both those technologies are used to produce algae, and we'll talk about it later in this class. So, what are we going to use algae to biomanufacture? Well, there are a variety of products that can be made. And in general, there's an inverse relationship between the volume of a product that is produced and the cost, meaning that commodities, which are produced at very low cost, have a very high volume. Other products, which are produced at very high cost, by definition have to have a very low volume. Things like shown here would be an antibody cancer drug. So the world supply of that is only a few kilograms, yet the cost of that can be as much as $1 million a kilogram. Whereas if we think about fuel, 1.2 trillion with a T gallons of fuel are consumed every year, but its cost is less than 40 cents a kilogram. With algae, we have an opportunity to make all of those, including food, nutraceuticals, and high-value products. So I think one of the important aspects of algae are, can we use this for food and nutrition? Certainly there are many companies, and we will describe those later on in this course, that are now using algae to either produce nutritional supplements, so these would be low volume products, but relatively high value, that we would add as an ingredient to another food, or can we actually use these to produce food itself directly that we would consume? And these are just a few examples of that, but we'll describe these in more detail later in the course. We also want to think if we can make polymers from algae. As I said, fuel is only 40 cents a kilogram, but polymers, which are also chains of carbon, which can be produced directly from algae, can sell as much as $4 or $5 a kilogram. So much more expensive. And with algae, we have an opportunity to make polymers, make those into products like the flip-flop shown here that can then be biodegraded. So we can have an algae polymer carbon cycle that I think can begin to address some of those issues that we see with ocean pollution. Certainly the biggest challenge that we have facing us is how do we get algae production at world scale? This is a picture of an algae facility down in New Mexico, which is used now to produce a nutraceutical. Clearly, we have an ability to go to scale. There are several companies that are using fermentation at world scale. So the opportunity is there, but I think one of the challenges is how do we do this on a world scale that is sufficient for all of the food, feed, and products we need? So thank you very much for your attention, and please enjoy the rest of the course.